My name is Amalia Weber. I'm the program specialist here at Rochester Hills Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's program, the American Guide Series. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details. Firstly, we ask that audience members please silence or turn off their cell phones before we begin in order to avoid any disturbances during the presentation. We'd also like to thank the Friends of the Rochester Hills Public Library and their many fundraising efforts. It's thanks to their support that we can provide wonderful programming like tonight's presentation. Our next program is Midnight, Detroit and the Underground Railroad, which will be an in-person event on Thursday, July 11th at 7 p.m. You can sign up for that at calendar.rhpl.org. Now, without further ado, please welcome Jim Kraft.
Okay. Is that loud enough? It sounds pretty loud to me. Is that okay? All right. Well, off we go. All right. So how many of you have ever heard of the American Guide series? Oh, look at that. We've got a whole audience here. People know what I'm talking about. Great. So this thing is, the American Guide series is really a subset of the New Deal, and it was a part of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. As you can see, well, from the quote up there, it was perhaps the noblest and most absurd undertakings ever attempted by any state. It's kind of an interesting program that this is a part of. But it turns out that it's also one of the most important, I think, pieces of information, I guess, about the United States ever produced. You're all familiar with John Steinbeck and his book Travels with Charlie, I assume. So in the mid-1960s, 66, 67, John Steinbeck is in Rocinante, which is the name he gave to the pickup truck that he had converted into a camper, and he drove around the country with his poodle, Charlie. When he was in Detroit Lakes in 1966 or 67, whenever he was there, in that section of the book, he writes, the problem was he didn't know anything about Detroit Lakes. He'd never heard of it before. And so he's driving through Detroit Lakes, and he writes in the book, if there had been room in Rocinante, I would have packed the WPA guides to the States, all 48 volumes of them. The complete set comprises the most comprehensive accounts of the United States ever got together, and nothing has approached it since. This is 2024, and nothing has approached it since. This is the most comprehensive study of American life ever produced. Now, the cool thing for me as a historian is that this was written in the 1930s. So it's not just a story of American life today, it's a story about American life as it was in the 1930s. The other thing I have to tell you is in 1968, I was hitchhiking through Detroit Lakes, and I didn't know anything about Detroit Lakes either.
Detroit Lakes in
Minnesota.
Minnesota. Okay.
Yeah. So these things were written in the 1930s, and obviously what's going on in the 1930s is the Great Depression. And you know, it was a time when all America was in Appalachia on the brink of war, when fascism was not a page in a history, but a living terror, when communism was the utopia to many Americans. This is the world that these books are written in, okay? The Depression was something beyond what any of us can comprehend. You can just take a look at a few of these stats up here about the depth of the Depression in 1933. I ran across some stats a few months ago, and it was talking about construction in the country, across the country. And it had some statistics on the building permits that were approved in various cities around the United States. And I don't have the numbers necessarily exactly right, but the ratios are right. In Detroit, in 1929, there were, say, $100 million worth of permits issued, building permits. In 1933, there were $3 million worth of permits. I was reading something not too long ago, and the guy was talking about the number of in 1933, 80% of the engineers and architects in this country were unemployed. 80%. I mean, the depth, of the Depression is just something we can't appreciate at all. The numbers here, say in 1933, this is the numbers of unemployed non-farm workers, so urban people basically. 37.6% of people were unemployed in the country that were non-farm workers. In Detroit, that number was probably more like 50%. Taking a look at the auto production between 1929 and 1933, well, translate that into how many people are working in these factories. Right? When they say unemployed, they mean fully unemployed. If you had a part-time job, you're not in those stats, okay? And so what would happen is if you work for Henry Ford, for example, you might work 1 day a week. Well, you're not unemployed then. So you don't show up in these stats. And the other thing is, today, how many two-income families are there? You lose one income today, and you still have somebody to fall back on. In 1933, you didn't have that, right? There wasn't that second income. The numbers are absolutely staggering. Now, Roosevelt gets elected in 1932, takes office in March of 1933. Roosevelt doesn't end the Depression with the New Deal. You can't make that claim. What he did was give people hope for the future. He did things to take the edge off of unemployment. He certainly didn't end unemployment with the New Deal, but it very much took the edge off of that unemployment. It gave people hope for the future, for tomorrow, frankly. And I don't mean tomorrow in the futuristic sense. I mean tomorrow, physically tomorrow. The programs of the New Deal kind of fall into, I think, 3 main categories. You have relief programs, which are, you don't have any food, here's some food, okay? You're gonna lose your house, here's a place, okay. Here's a place for you to live, okay? Here's housing. That's what relief is. Then you had work. Part of this is get the economy moving again, and part of it is, am I turned off?
No, I turned it down a little bit to get rid of the reverb.
Okay. So put people back to work. And some of that is stimulate the economy, and some of it is direct hiring of workers. That's sort of what we're talking about. The category today is really the work relief programs. And then you have reform. Things like, Social Security and unemployment insurance and the FDIC and all of that kind of stuff that we take for granted today that simply didn't exist in the past. The New Deal brought all that stuff in. So the program, one of the important silos here is the idea of putting people back to work. Now, some of that is stimulate the economy, but some of that is create jobs through government programs of one kind or another. The PWA, the WPA, FERA, Civil Works Administration. The one that we're going to be talking about today is the large, oops, what did I just do? The largest, is there a?
It's the big circle in the middle.
Oh, okay. The largest of these programs is the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, that gets started in 1935. There's a bill passed in the spring of 1935 that allocated about $4 billion for relief programs. Most of that wound up in the WPA. Okay. Now, by this time, the United States had been in depression for north of 5 years, okay, by 1935. And so that the unemployment was just so widespread, and the desperation was so widespread. Now, most people in this country were blue-collar workers. You go back to 1933, and you had a shovel in your hand, or you worked on the line somewhere, or you were a farmer, or whatever. You were a blue-collar worker. And the main emphasis of these unemployment programs was to get those unemployed workers back to work. But they weren't the only ones hit by all of this. And there was a category of worker that kind of got identified as kind of creative types that by 1935, they had been unemployed for years. Theater workers, musicians. The Detroit Symphony basically shut down during the Depression. Okay, teachers were laid off. Hundreds of thousands of teachers lost their job in the Depression. But these were creative workers that didn't have any source of income. And in the WPA, the head of the WPA, a guy by the name of Harry Hopkins, made the decision that that the WPA was going to do something to try to help those workers too. He got up in front of a bunch of newsmen and kind of was, did whatever it is you do in front of a bunch of newsmen and gave him a little talk, and then they started asking questions. And a couple of them started going after him for this program that he was going to launch called Federal One. Federal One was going to put artists, theater workers, musicians, and writers back to work. And he was being challenged on the logic of that. And Hopkins' response was, hell, writers have to eat too. And then he just turned around and walked off the stage. In any event, this is what we're talking about. It's this very small piece of the WPA called Federal One that was broken into 4 categories to put artists, musicians, theater people, and writers back to work. It made up a tiny fraction of the WPA, less than 1%. So it's not a big program, but it's something that you really hear about. I'm sure all of you are familiar with federal art projects, murals and that sort of thing that are around the country. That comes out of this program. What you're not familiar with probably are the other 3, and in particular the Federal Writers Project and those books that you have in your hand. That was the main produce of the Federal Writers Project. The guy who was put in charge of the program, the first director, was a guy by the name of Henry Alsberg. Now he is one interesting guy. His friends would refer to him as a bit of an odd duck, and he was a bit of an odd duck. But he was a very good writer, an excellent editor. He had a very diverse experience. He was born in New York to a kind of a prosperous Upper East Side intellectual family. By the time he's 21, he graduated from Columbia Law School. He spends time, he decides he wants to work in the theater, goes to Harvard to get a master's degree in literature, comes back, spends a year or 2 kind of slumming it in Greenwich Village. Although at night he went home to stay with Mama, who had a nice house up in the Upper East Side. And then winds up working in the newspapers in New York in the 19-teens, and then goes off to work as a secretary for the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. He's in Europe. He's in the Ottoman Empire when the United States goes to war in World War I. He spends the next 4 years in Europe as a correspondent. And after the war, he spends most of his time in Eastern Europe, which was not a very safe place to be in 1919, 1920. And Alsberg was not only there working as a correspondent, he also had a satchel filled with money that he was carrying around and giving it to, he was working as a volunteer for a Jewish refugee organization, and he was literally carrying bags of money around, giving it to communities, Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. I'm not sure I'd really want that responsibility in 1920 in that part of the world. It was a very dangerous place. But the point is, he meets Lenin a couple of times. He becomes friends with Emma Goldman. Anybody know who Emma Goldman is?
Didn't she demonstrate in New York City?
I'm sure she demonstrated pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, she is probably the most prominent anarchist in the world at this time. She's older than Alsberg, but they kind of developed this relationship, and for the rest of her life, she and Alsberg are buddies. In any event, he has an interesting time, comes back to New York, gets back into the theater, and spends the next 10 years in kind of experimental theater and then occasionally working as a newspaperman. When the Depression hits, he builds a little cottage, shack he called it, and it was a shack. There was no water, no electricity, anything like that, on his brother's farm, which was north of New York City, about 50 or 60 miles on the Hudson River. So that's where he's at in 1930, 31, 32. When the New Deal starts, he gets contacted by one of his Eastern intellectual buddies who got hired to lead a program, one of the New Deal programs, and they put him to work as a publicist. And this is the book that Alsberg writes in 1934 about the Civil Works Administration. If you get a chance afterwards, There's all kinds of pictures in here about the different kinds of projects that are going on, including in here, as I was bouncing through here, Mary Chase Stratton is in here. Puabic Pottery did work for the Civil Works Administration and for the WPA eventually. In any event, Alsberg is a really interesting guy. One of the things that is also true about him is at this point he's 55. He's a smart guy. He had hobnobbed with some very important people in the intellectual community and because of his social connections, his family's social connections. He was a well-connected guy, but in his mind, I'm sure he had not been successful. This was his chance. When he became the director of the Federal Writers Project, it's his last best chance to do something extraordinary, and I think he did. So, the WPA has got this Federal One program going. Alsberg's in charge of the writers, and you've got the artists, the theater people, and the musicians. Well, for those people, the artists, the theater people, and the musicians, it's pretty easy to figure out what they're going to do. We're going to give these guys a bunch of money, and they're going to go do paintings, whether they're murals or canvas paintings or whatever. They're going to do public art. They're going to teach art. What are the musicians going to do? They're going to perform. They subsidize orchestras, they subsidize dance bands, they subsidize, folk groups. They do performances, in libraries. They do them in auditoriums all over the country. They do them in parks. They put together children's bands, orchestras. They teach music. And the theater folks are putting on performances, again, all over the country, okay? Sometimes in high school stages, sometimes in legitimate theaters in various places around the country. So it's easy to figure out what they're going to do, honestly. The big question is, what are you going to do with writers? You can't very well give a writer $100 a month and tell them to go home and write the great American novel. What are you going to get? Probably nothing. A very high likelihood it's going to be trash, and most embarrassing of all, it's going to be something that makes the government look bad. It might be, and in this time, there was a very high likelihood that was going to happen because the writers in this country had swung left in the 1920s and 30s. Many of them were members of the John Reed Society. Have you ever seen the movie Reds with Warren Beatty? That's John Reed. And after he goes to Russia and he works, he's a communist, and in the 1920s, he dies in Russia, but in the 1920s, they organized these John Reed clubs that were essentially organized to get American writers to produce proletarian literature. And they kind of fall under the sway of the Communist Party. Anyway, a lot of writers belong to the John Reed Society. A lot of people in this country were very left-leaning. So that wasn't unusual. The point is, we don't want to have a government program that's producing that kind of literature. So what are we going to do with these folks? Well, we wanted something that would give the widest basis for employment of writers. We want to put a lot of people to work, but at the same time would not involve their souls too much, and also would not involve the government in censorship. So what are we going to do? And the answer comes, we're going to write tour books. Okay? There had been some examples of these tour books that had existed. You're all familiar with folders and different kinds of guides. When you go on your boat cruise, you go buy guides. Well, they existed then too. The most prominent was Baedeker's. This is a reprint of the 1893 Baedeker's Guide to the United States. There you see a list, and the red books are all Baedeker's guides. Alsberg and others who had traveled in Europe would have used Baedeker's guides when they were wandering around Europe. In Connecticut, in the Civil Works Administration, they actually produced a guide. Here it is. Okay, this is what they did in 1934. And then also in 1934, there was a director in Michigan who suggested to the WPA that that's what they do, is they hire writers to start producing these guides. That was in 1934, actually before the WPA. So in any event, when Alsberg gets appointed here in June of 1935, there's some questions as to what they're going to do. There's a bunch of brainstorming sessions, but pretty quickly they came to the conclusion that the right answer was to produce tour guides. One of the reasons for producing the tour guides is that it's safe. It's not going to get you in trouble, all right? And they want to avoid trouble. But the kind of the goal of this is to hold up a mirror to America. That's kind of the phrase that you keep seeing. We're going to hold up a mirror to America and record what we see. We're going to go around the country and we're going to hold up a mirror. Here's Rochester. What do we find in Rochester? What do we find in, Imlay City? What do we find on the, the northwest coast of Michigan? And we're going to hold up a mirror and just report what we see. And the other thing that's going on here is we're going to capture this stuff before it's gone. They recognized, I think, that the United States was changing. Now, there's a lot of change going on, but I think the thing that they're talking about at this time is that the United States is rapidly moving towards a totally urban society. And the old world of the 19th century that was still rural was still there, but it was disappearing rapidly. We're going to capture that. And so we go with the tour guides. They're safe. They're non-controversial. They can you can write 100 pages about Rochester, or you can write a paragraph about Rochester. You can go big, you can go small. You can research all kinds of stuff. The possibility of putting people to work was enormous. And you didn't have to put somebody's name at the bottom of the book, right? This is stuff that lends itself to be done by committee, right? There's no names at the bottom of any of these books, right? They're all done by committee. And again, the nature of these tour guides makes that possible. So the theory is this is all going to be easy. We're not going to make anybody angry. The problem is Alsberg didn't much care if he made people angry. Right? He was out to produce, and the people that went to work for him were out to produce something that was a reflection of the United States. In the words of the assistant director of Michigan, warts and all. And a part of this had to do with the ethnic diversity of the United States. That really is something that's largely ignored in this period. It's white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that run the country. And there's these other people there, we know that, but we're not going to make a big deal out of them. Well, that isn't this Jewish guy from the Upper East Side, right? Racial groups, at this time, racial really meant ethnic. Okay, the term racial is used constantly, but they're really talking about ethnic groups. Ethnic groups have, within our own time, awakened to the preciousness of their own individuality, of being themselves, of singing their own songs, writing poetry in their own tongues. No amount of ridicule or oppression will wean them from that goal. Alsberg was fine with that, okay? And so, well, here's another thing that comes up here. I think the Federal Writers Project winds up being kind of the way the New Deal could present itself in terms of its kind of philosophy of life in America. We live in a very diverse world. The United States is a very diverse country. And New Dealers kind of gloried in that. Hitler, in 1935, said in one of his many speeches that America is a nation of mongrels. The melting pot? To Hitler, it's a nation of mongrels. Well, Eleanor isn't going to let that go by. Our nation enjoys its strength and its vitality because we are a melting pot. Because we have widely differing backgrounds, ideas, cultures that have merged and have made exciting the prospect of our pursuit of happiness. That's a New Deal idea. And in my view, the Federal Writers Project perfectly reflects that. And so what comes out of all of this is the State Guide series. There's kind of four main projects. The first and most important are these state guides that you see sitting up here. There are 52 state guides. The 48 states, plus Alaska, Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., and New York City, which was deemed to be too big to roll under the state of New York, so they created a separate project for it. So there's 52 books like this. Plus, there's about 100 books in this guide series sequence that are cities, regions that are over 200 pages. And then there's another 100 or 200 that are smaller. You know, the Oregon Trail is about 400 pages long. The Scene St. Augustine is probably 50 pages long. So there are various lengths, but in total, there's about 200 to 300 books that fall into this guide series. Then you have, and again, remember they're out there collecting all this information, and you can make Rochester this much information or this much information that you put in the book, but you collect this much. What are you going to do with the extra? And so there's a recognition from the very beginning that we're going to collect a lot of data. And what happens is the data that gets collected that doesn't go into the book winds up supporting other projects. One of the things that had been done in the CWA before the WPA got started was they started to interview slaves, former slaves, from various states. Probably fairly well known, you may know about this. They interviewed something like 2,500 former slaves and collected their stories. Today, those have all been published. They didn't get published during the Depression. Okay? And the reason they didn't get published during the Depression we'll kind of talk about later, but essentially they ran out of money. Okay? What they also did was start to produce ethnic studies about different ethnic groups around the country. The one here, the Italians of New York, as you can see, that obviously got published. There was one on the Finns of the Keweenaw Peninsula. That one never got published during the Depression either. But there were a lot of these ethnic studies. They got into folklore as a part of going out and finding out about what America is like. You're going to collect folklore. Now, initially, and this is kind of a new science, really. It's a new social science that starts to evolve, in the 19-teens, maybe the 1920s. Folklore starts to become a serious study. And what most people were talking about at this time was folklore in the sense of, you know, Uncle Remus and Paul Bunyan. It's rural folklore. But what happened is in the Federal Writers Project, they started to move also towards urban folklore. And that sort of morphed into life histories. They interviewed later, it didn't start off this way, but by 1937, they're starting to do a bunch of oral histories of people in various walks of life, ranging from prostitutes to circus clowns to coal miners. And they went out and did all kinds of oral histories of these people. They started to tape record, although most of this was not tape recorded, it was all hand.
Under whose supervision was this done?
The director of the program was Harry Hopkins, was the head of the WPA. As you get down to the Federal Writers Project was Henry Alsberg, and then when you get down to each state, there was a state director, and then I'll get to how this work got assigned. The point is this stuff was collected. Sometimes it got published. You can see pioneer dance calls in Nebraska. A lot of it never got published, okay, because they kind of ran out of money late in the Depression. Well, there's actually more to it than that. But the point is that this material was collected. It's still there. I mean, you're going to play heck trying to find some of it, but there are just millions of words that these researchers collected and got partway into producing these books that never got finished. So if you're ever interested in looking for kind of raw material to write a book about American society in the 1930s, here's where you go. Okay? There's just tons of this information out there. And then the fourth category, these were tour guides that they were building. Okay? So if you're going on vacation and you jump in your 1932 Ford Model A and you want to go drive around the country, you get one of these tour books, and where are you going to go? Well, you're going to go to recreational places too. Okay? And so there's a lot of recreation and natural publications that come out of this. In the end, these four categories produced about 2,000 books, 2,000 publications. I needed to mention one more guy here. You're all familiar with Studs Terkel? Studs Terkel? Studs Terkel worked for the WPA in the 1930s. Now, he personally wrote scripts for radio. But at night, when he went to the local pub after work, The buddies he met were people working on this program in Chicago. And so he got involved in oral history by his involvement with the Federal Writers Project. Not that he was doing this, his buddies were, but he got very interested in it. Anyway, Alsberg put together what I think is a very impressive team of people that worked out of Washington. They were the giving direction, they were editing, they weren't out collecting data. There were thousands of people out collecting data. But I think it's important to mention, especially Sterling Brown. It didn't take Alsberg very long to figure out that blacks were not going to get a fair shake in this book, because the books were arranged by state. You turn Alabama loose to write a book about Alabama in 1935, it's going to be run by whites, and what are they going to say about blacks? Well, first of all, they're going to ignore them. And then secondly, they're going to use kind of Jim Crow kind of language to describe black society. I think one of the interesting things is that the first version of the Alabama Writer's Guide did not have any information about George Washington Carver and Tuskegee Institute. It wasn't mentioned. Now, Tuskegee Institute had been world famous by that time for 50 years. Doesn't show up in the book. So the point is that Alsberg saw that happening, and within a few months he hired Sterling Brown, who was a professor of literature at Brown University, or at Howard University in Washington, and put him to work as an editor, keeping an eye on what was going on. Now, all of this stuff was still being written locally. We're talking about an editorial function here. Sterling Brown didn't write anything. He edited. He tried to, challenge what was being produced. And that's what these guys did. They challenged a lot of what was being produced. There's others that go on in here. Now, this whole business of trying to produce guidebooks that were going to be non-controversial, it sounds good in theory. But what do you hold the mirror up to? And what's the perspective you're going to take? And that's where they got in trouble. Okay. It was almost impossible to do what they were trying to do, which is create a non-controversial guide of America. This was a time in American society that was extraordinarily volatile. There was all kinds of conflict, whether you're talking about New Dealers versus anti-New Dealers, Jim Crow people versus blacks, the DAR versus recent immigrants. You take your pick. There's all kinds of serious conflict going on here in American society. If you're going to hold a mirror up to society, no matter who you hold that mirror up, you are almost certainly going to anger somebody. Okay? And that's exactly what happened. That the Federal Writers Project didn't get out of this squeaky clean in the sense of not angering people. They angered a lot of people. Again, Alsberg didn't care. We're going to hold a mirror up. We're going to show America as it is, and that's what they did. Right? It's what makes this thing, I think, so important, a piece of literature. I've run across in recent books that comment on or talk about the Federal Writers Project, and one of the common gripes that people have in this generation in 2000 or 2024 that write about the Federal Writers Project is that it's racist. What were they writing about? 1935 America. Do you think 1935 America was just a bit racist? And so it reflects the attitudes of Americans in the era they were producing this. I don't think that's a criticism of the Federal Writers Project. I think it's absolutely one of the great things about it, is that it holds the mirror up to America. You may not like what you see, but that's what was there. And while you had editors in Washington trying to clean some of this stuff up, there was only one so far with it, okay? You were reflecting America as it existed. And again, it got them in trouble. Any event, there's some other things going on with getting this thing started. So Alsberg is appointed director in June. By the end of the summer, they've agreed that they're going to work on the guide series. They're going to write these 52 books. There's going to be these spin-off projects that are going to be going on. But they're starting from zero, okay? There's no infrastructure there. So building the infrastructure took some time. One of the problems they ran into was the purpose. Why are we doing this? And the purpose was the projects themselves, no matter how important and interesting, come second. This was about putting people to work. Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Hopkins, frankly, didn't care about the output. They just didn't care. They wanted people to be put to work. Now, if we can put them to work doing productive things, so much the better, like building roads and airports and schools and all of that. And they want good stuff to come out of this, but it's secondary. This was from the director in Minnesota. At the end of a few weeks, the forlorn men and women I had hired were different people. Heads were raised, shoulders squared, eyes lost their haunting fear, smiles were no longer self-deprecating. New clothes were worn jauntily. At that stage, little mattered except that the hopeless men and women had found their hope again. That's what this thing was all about. But it does get in the way. Yes?
You've referenced Mangione a couple times.
Yeah. Well, Mangione he was worked in Washington. He was one of the guys that Allsburg hired, and he wrote one of the first books about the Federal Writers Project in 1970, whatever. So when I started to dive into Mangione, it was one of the places I went. And because he was a first-hand witness, you wind up with pretty good quotes about what was going on at the time. Because he knew these people, right? He was there. So Mangione, you'll see him in several occasions. So first of all, you've got this problem of what are we here for, okay? The next thing, you had to find people. Now, this was not too difficult in a place like Detroit or New York City or Chicago, where you had lots of people who had literary talents that were unemployed. But how are you going to do this in Idaho? How are you going to do this in Kansas or North Dakota or Nevada? Where are you going to find the writers that have the talent to actually do this? I mean, first of all, if you're a writer, do you live in Idaho, right? And can you get, so that was a problem, trying to get people. And then you had to hang on to them. The second director of the state of Michigan, for example, the first director was a political hack, so they got rid of her. But the second one was a pretty good guy, and he did a very good job for 6 months, and then he got a better job and quit. Well, that's precisely what he should do. This was not lifetime employment for any of these people. But the third guy that came in was not so good. Michigan wound up having a half a dozen different directors during the time that this occurred. Though one of them wound up replacing Allsburg. When Allsburg got let go in 1939, the Michigan director replaced Allsburg. And he was apparently a very organized and a good administrator. Didn't have anywhere near the passion of Allsburg, but he was a good administrator. Any event, you had lots of problems in trying to find people. You didn't have, you had budget problems. Roosevelt, no matter what his critics will say, Roosevelt always wanted to balance the budget. And so when the economy started to pick up, he'd lay people off on these programs in an effort to balance the budget. Well, so you get somebody working on these projects, and then there's a cut. And then some of them would get rehired later when the economy tanked again. And so you had this, you're losing people that were getting laid off. Then you had just the whole problem of trying to hire, and they wound up hiring, it peaked out at about 9,000 people on the Federal Writers Project. On the WPA totally, there were about 3 million people working. So the WPA is 3 million people. Of those, maybe maximum 10,000 worked in the in the Federal Writers Project. And that was the largest of these Federal One programs. So it was not a big number. Bottom line is, just finding those people was a problem and getting it sorted out. And so you had some, political hacks, cranks, and alcoholics that littered the first wave of employment here. A friend of Eleanor's Roosevelt's wanted to get a job on the Federal Writers Project. And this guy applied apparently, and Eleanor sent Henry a note saying, this guy's a good writer. If you hire him, that's fine, but don't put him in an administrative job because he's an alcoholic, and he'll disappoint you. Alsberg's response was, if we had a rule not to hire alcoholics, we wouldn't have anybody on the force. One of the guys that I have to talk about, and he's, by modern definitions, you would probably call him simply a pig. But Orrick Johns was apparently a very good writer. And he wound up being the second director of the New York City project. But he was also a bit of a drinker. He was a bit of a womanizer. And he had a wooden leg. So apparently one of his pastimes was after work, he'd go down to the local pub and have a few, and then take his wooden leg off and slam it down in the bar, challenge the locals to a fight. Come on. He just imagine something like that going on. And again, he was a womanizer. And so he made a run at a young woman who worked in the office, whose boyfriend was an ex-Marine. And the ex-Marine broke into Orrick Johns' apartment, hid in the closet. When Orrick Johns came home, your guess is as good as mine as to whether he was a bit sloshed at that point. But in any event, this Marine jumped out, beat him up so badly he was hospitalized for several weeks, maybe several months, and set his leg on fire. Now the Marine, of course, winds up in jail. Orrick Johns comes back to work 6 months later, is immediately fired for his behavior. But this sort of thing, Mangione, you can find a lot of the stuff in Mangione because he saw this. And he's got some pretty interesting stories in there about some just bizarre things that happened around the country with, trying to get these people hired. The other thing that's going on here.
Ask you what the 1 to 10 paupers rule was.
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. 90% of the people that came to work on the WPA and the Federal Writers Project had to be certified paupers, which means you had to go down to your local government and attest that you had no visible means of support. You had to sign it on a piece of paper. If you had a car, we'll sell it. Okay. If you had a home, you got to sell the house, right? If your spouse had a job, if you were living with your parents, you don't qualify. It was demeaning, among other things. And so people, especially early on in this, do it. Now, this was not federal government. This was the holdover from the pauper system that got started back in Elizabethan England. Okay. Taking care of the poor was always local responsibility. For the federal government to get involved in this was simply, Hoover couldn't imagine it, for example. Can't do that. It's a local problem, right? Roosevelt had an entirely different view of it, but especially early on, this stuff is working through local relief agencies. And local relief agencies basically assumed if you're poor, it's your fault. Go get a job, you lazy sod. But if you got kids, you can go take some cans of peaches out of the box back there. We got peaches in the other day. You don't have any coal for your furnace? Well, listen, we've got some wood over there behind it. Go get some wood. But you can only take 4 pieces. It's horribly demeaning welfare system that existed. In any event, that's what that refers to, is that they could hire 10% of the people like the Orrick Johns of the world to be the administrators, but everybody else had to be, 90% of the employees had to be proven paupers. And again, in that era, that was a horrible blow to people's egos. They didn't want to do it. Writers especially. Then you get to the whole problem here that we kind of started this off with, that this country was in Appalachia. There was fascists, there was communists, there was enormous poverty. Well, this political rivalry is something that we probably don't appreciate at the time. There are a lot of communists, there are a lot of fascists wandering around this country in the 1930s. In late 1939, Anne Morrow Lindbergh wrote a book. It wasn't published until the first like the first week of January 1940, called The Wave of the Future. Now, Anne Morrow Lindbergh is Charles Lindbergh's wife. She was a legitimate and well-known author in her own right. She writes this book, The Wave of the Future. And in it, what she says is, American democracy, American capitalism has failed. And what you need to do is pick left or pick right. You either go be a communist or you go be a fascist, because this middle-of-the-road American democracy has failed. You got to make a choice. Charles Coughlin in Royal Oak said exactly the same thing in 1935. And he had no bones about it. I, for one, am a fascist. So was Lindbergh. Now, she didn't make any big deal about that in the book. She said, you know, there's these two sides. The American version has failed. Take your choice. The Lindberghs were certainly fascists. They were friends of Hitler's. In any event, that is going on in a lot of places around the country, particularly in the larger cities. I mean, the New York office was just riddled with these kinds of problems of clashes with communists and non-communists. And in New York, it was a special problem because it wasn't just communists versus other people. It was the communists against communists. Trotsky and Leninists would literally have punch-ups in the office in New York. It was a mess. Well, the point is that these are all problems that the WPA, or that the Federal Writers Project faced. Michigan experienced all of this stuff. You know, the Detroit office had a lot of problems. Not as bad as New York, but we had at least simpler versions of these same kinds of things going on in the United States, or in the Detroit office. One of the things is kind of interesting is the first director was Cecile Chittenden, and her assistant was Mary Barrett. Well, Chittenden was a political hack, and Mary Barrett, there's her. Not only will we include Ford's phenomenal contribution to the science of production, we will also write about the Ford Hunger March. We're going to hold a mirror up to America, and we're going to show it, warts and all. That includes Ford as this brilliant producer of the Model T and an industrial genius, and it includes Ford as the guy who's going to have his thugs open fire on marchers in Dearborn. They're both Henry Ford. We're going to show you both of them. Well, Chittenden didn't like that. These two kind of got into a bit of a battle. They both got fired. The interesting thing is that when Alsberg was being told about what was going on in Michigan, and somebody was warning him about Mary Barrett, he says, she's a real firecracker. And Alsberg hired her and brought her to Washington. We need firecrackers. But she winds up in Washington for the rest of the program. The project itself was centered in, obviously, in Washington with Alsberg's team of people, and then 5 regional supervisors around the country that were responsible for different areas, and they reported into Alsberg. And then each of those regional supervisors had states that would report into them. And then in Michigan, you had 8 district offices at its peak. Those were probably closed down by the end of '36, and you just had a few of those because they'd collected the raw data and now they're assembling. And then you had field workers that were assigned to each of these district offices. Okay. Now, where it got to be tricky was that the Federal Writers Project was part of the WPA. So within each state, there was always this battle between the Washington office and the state WPA director. The state WPA director wanted to treat these state office directors as their appointees. Well, and you wind up, especially early on, with a bunch of political hacks that had no ability and were certainly not signed up to the Federal Writers Project mission. So it took Alsberg a while. In the end, I think he kind of cleared this stuff out. And he put together, I think, a pretty good team, except that you have a lot of turnover. But at least he generally won the battles here with the WPA directors. Now, what would happen here, and there's actually a fascinating manual, if you like this sort of thing, and probably nobody does, but I do. I think it's kind of cool. Alsberg and his team put together a manual on how these books were going to be written, and it comes out in like September of 1935. It goes through about 30 iterations, but if you get a hold of one, you can kind of see, and have a copy of the book sitting there, you can see how these books are laid out, and it's in the manual, okay? So it's pretty good, in my view. But what would happen is you'd get a field worker that would be assigned to go to Rochester and do a research on, what's the drug company over here? Park Davis. Go do some research on Park Davis. And the researcher would go out there and do a bunch of research on Park Davis, and they'd come back with notes, and then they would have to convert their notes into a first draft, and then they'd take their first draft and convert that into a second draft. And that second draft everything would be in duplicate. At that stage, part of the duplicate would go to the local library, okay? And the rest of it would go to the state office. And then the state office would take that material that was collected and fit it into the book that they were producing, okay? And then once they got a chapter done, or however this thing was being subdivided, they would send those chapters off to Washington, and then Washington would edit it, and then you'd get this back and forth thing going on. This is the interesting thing. Alsberg expected, in the manual, he talks about the field workers, if you're going to have a typical state, we got a typical state. Here we go, Arkansas. This book will ultimately have 175,000 words in it, in an average state. The state will produce a version of this with 500,000 words. The field workers will create 5 million words. Field workers go from, the state will take the 5 million words, get it down to 500,000 words, and then the feds will take the 500,000 words and get it down to 175,000. Now that wasn't the numbers they were looking at, but it's the ratio that I think is interesting. The point is this: there's millions of words out there that were never in the books. They were never intended to be in the books. They were always expected to be given back then to the local communities, and other people would use those to do other works later on. Some of this stuff winds up in those other projects that we talked about. The point is, there's a ton of information out there. Now, where it is, who knows? Theoretically, it was given to the local libraries. The hope is, I haven't found any of that, by the way, that there's a lot of it that's in the National Archives in Washington. Michigan doesn't have any of it.
Oh, you might be getting to this, but how were the field workers paid? Were they paid by hours worked or words that they wrote?
It was hours worked.
Hours worked.
Yep. They did have targets.
Pardon?
They did have targets they were supposed to meet.
Oh. Could they fudge and pretend?
You've probably worked in various environments in your life. Did you ever fudge anything?
No.
Okay, well, there's your answer. Did you ever see it done? People fudging.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, there's your answer. No, but theoretically, these guys were held pretty tight, on a pretty tight leash. And, you know, the thing is, these are people that hadn't worked for 6 years. How much fudging do you think is going on here? Any event, it took a while for Alsberg and his team to get this thing firing. But by the time you get to the end of 1936, I think the team is actually working pretty well. They're starting to really start to crank things out. The first of the books that is produced, completed, the first state guide that's completed, is the Idaho book. Now, this is the Idaho book. You guys all have a copy of your book. Look at your book. In fact, hold up all of those books so everybody can see, right? Now look at the Idaho book. It's different.
Nice.
It's nice. Oh, yeah, it's very nice. But it's different. And the reason it's different is Vardis Fisher. Vardis Fisher produced the first book. The first one published was in Idaho. And he was the writer. It's the only state, really, where this was not done by committee. Vardis Fisher basically took the view that there wasn't anybody else in Idaho capable of writing anything, so I'll do it all by myself. And he did. He went all around the state, he took pictures. I think he had a photographer with him. But he wrote everything. He did the research, he did the writing, he did the editing. And then he was ready to get it done. He's ready to go. Okay, Henry, I've got one ready to go. Alsberg told me repeatedly that for Idaho to be the first among the 48 states would be a dreadful embarrassment. I thought the national office so incompetent and cynical and political that I cared nothing about its embarrassment. Vardis was not a team player. You can find YouTubes of Vardis Fisher being interviewed in the early 60s. He's a cranky old man. And I think you would find that at 30 years old, Vardis Fisher was a cranky old man. But you know Vardis Fisher. You ever seen the movie Jeremiah Johnson with Robert Redford? That's Vardis Fisher's book.
Which one?
Jeremiah Johnson. I started to read Jeremiah Johnson once, Vardis Fisher's book, a few years ago. And as I went through it, it was like, I saw this movie. It was almost exactly the same thing. There wasn't much different, you know. And I never finished it. But he was a very well-known writer of Western stuff. And he didn't like Henry Alsberg. He didn't like the New Deal. He didn't like the Federal Writers Project. And yet he worked for the Federal Writers Project until it ended. Any event, Vardis was going to come out with his book. Henry didn't want him to produce the book first, so he sends his right-hand man out to Boise to kind of talk some sense into Vardis. Vardis shows up at the train station to pick this guy up. Of course, you can't fly, you know, phone calls are difficult, you can't Zoom call, so he sends his guy out on the train, and Vardis and his publisher pick him up at the train station, take him back to Vardis's office, or maybe it was to the publisher's office, I can't remember, and get him drunk. And they get him completely hammered. The next morning, they put him on a train to send him back to Washington and walk down to the publisher's office and start publishing the book. Now, the good news is Idaho, that is this book, is an almost unalloyed triumph. 50-odd volumes of the National Guide, if they are up to this standard, will not only vindicate the Writers' Project, but will heighten our national self-consciousness, preserve invaluable antiquarian material, and facilitate, and this is an important one, facilitate our knowledge of ourselves. That's the Saturday Review of Literature. Vardis did okay. And in fact, you're going to find those kinds of comments about virtually every Federal Writers Project book that gets produced. They were very widely acclaimed when they were produced. Right? Now, that was early in 1937. Shortly after that, the second book came out, the Washington, D.C. book, which is the one Alsberg wanted to come out first. I didn't bring that with me because it's too heavy, right? I couldn't fit it in my suitcases. It would make them too, I need to hire somebody to bring this. I have these two skinny women back here that are my gophers, and they're not strong enough to carry this book, so I couldn't bring it. It too doesn't look like the rest of them. It's just bigger. It's 1,200 pages. It's a bigger size than these books. It's a monster. But if you ever want to find out anything about Washington, D.C., you go to that book, because it's there. It is an incredible book. Eventually, they came out with a simplified version that's only 550 pages. But the real one is 1,200 pages. It's a monster. That came out second, and then in the summer of 1937, New England books came out. And they were all very widely received, well received, highly acclaimed as they came out by the critics, the Saturday Review type of people. Now, the problem is, as I mentioned, Alsberg didn't care about whether there was controversy. He's going to hold the mirror up to America. And that gets us to a couple of problems. Who has the Washington or the Massachusetts book? You have the Massachusetts book? Okay, read the Sacco and Vanzetti bit. Anybody know who Sacco and Vanzetti are? They were, well, go ahead. This is what's in the book about Sacco and Vanzetti.
In 1920, a fish peddler, Bartolomeo Vanzetti, and a shoe worker, Nicolas Sacco, both members of the Galliani group of anarchists, were arrested on the charge of murder and robbery in connection with the theft of a $15,000 payroll. Despite their alibis, the highly circumstantial nature of the evidence, and the commendations of previous employers, they were ultimately both adjudged guilty. During the 7 years that elapsed between the murder and the execution of their sentence, protest demonstrations were held throughout the world. President Lowell of Harvard, President Stratton of MIT, and Judge Robert Grant were invited by Governor Fuller to weigh the evidence and advise him. They upheld the finding of the court, and Sacco and Vanzetti were executed on August 23, 1927. It is widely believed that, although legal forms were observed, the determining factor in the case from start to finish was the affiliation of the two men with an unpopular minority political group.
The anarchists. They were arrested in the midst of the Red Scare. The judge, a guy by the name of Thayer, called them those anarchist bastards in public. The trial was a bit of a sham. But that's what's in the book. And that just infuriated the Boston Brahmins. When they got far enough into the book to read that section, they came out a few weeks after the book was published and started to go after the Federal Writers Project. You guys are all a bunch of communists. The guy who was the editor of this book was Ray Billington, who was one of the most prominent historians of the 20th century, Western historians. There's any historian who would read that paragraph would say, yeah, that's about right. But one of the things that got the Boston Brahmins annoyed is that's a full paragraph on Sacco and Vanzetti. There's half that much about the Boston Tea Party. So again, there's this, you've got different political agendas here. Then you had, when the Washington book came out, this is kind of an interesting tale. There's a party at Allsburg's house in Washington, in Georgetown, I think. He and 3 other guys had rented a big house in Georgetown, and when the book came out, they had a party, invited everybody from the Washington office and the powers that be in Federal One, some WPA guys there, and they had a party to celebrate the production of this 1,200-page book. And there were a couple of black guys there that worked in the office, and they were invited. And Allsburg's boss, who by this time was Helen Woodward, who was a woman from Mississippi, she's there. And so they have a party, okay? The next day in the Senate, Senator Theodore Bilbo gets up in front of the senators and goes after Allsburg and goes after this party that they had the night before. If this had happened in Mississippi long before the sounds of revelry had died, the perpetrator of this crime, that is Allsburg, would be hanging from the highest magnolia tree. This is 1937. They did that in Mississippi in 1937. This is no joke. Now, Roosevelt and Hopkins, they thought these people were just idiots, and they just laughed it off. They shouldn't have, because what this is kind of signs of what's coming. So, the next few years, or the next year or so, there's these books start getting cranked out, okay, in 37, 38. But the worm is turning in Washington. Not the least of which is Hitler is becoming more of a concern to Roosevelt than the New Deal. Okay, and basically what happens is that conservatives start to regain control. In the 1936 election, there were 334 Democrats elected to the House of Representatives, 88 Republicans. Big landslide for the Democrats. But look at the popular vote. 56% for Democrats, 40% for Republicans. Huge win. 2 years later, 262 Democrats, 169 Republicans, but look at the popular vote. They're very, very close. Roosevelt by now, by 1938, is in now entering into the third year of his second term as president. Nobody expects him to run for president a third term. They're lining up to replace him. They want to take shots at the New Deal, they want to take shots at Roosevelt, so that either the Republicans want to put a Republican in, or conservative Democrats, i.e. Southern Democrats in particular, want to replace Roosevelt, who is just far too liberal for their tastes. Those 262 Democrats, many of them were Southern Democrats. And they didn't have much particular use for the New Deal. They went along with it because they're good, loyal Democrats. But Roosevelt did stuff that you've just seen on the previous slide that they didn't like. And, of course, you have this whole political thing that's going on. And so what happens, you guys are all familiar with Joe McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee. It goes back to the mid-30s. And the most active period of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which had started a little bit before this, was Martin Dye's committee. And he was everything that Joe McCarthy was. So whatever you think of Joe McCarthy in terms of being a balanced human being, Martin Dye's was the same guy. And his committee went after the New Deal. They went after Roosevelt. But the target, the easy target, was the Federal Writers Project and the Federal Theater Project. And that's what they honed in on. And the idea was to make Roosevelt, make the New Deal, make the WPA look bad. Dye's wanted to be president. Okay. When you get a chance, before you leave here tonight, run to the movie section and get the movie, The Cradle Will Rock. It is a great movie, great actors. You want to get that. It's about this period in American history when the Dyes Committee is going after the federal one, going after the Writers Project, going after the Theater Project. It's focused on the Theater Project, and there isn't much about the Federal Writers Project. But the Federal Writers Project is going through the same thing. It was the Theater and the Writers Project that Dyes went after. And that's what that movie's about. It is a great movie. In any event, what happened essentially here is that Roosevelt is increasingly concerned about Hitler. He's increasingly concerned about rearming the United States. And he simply can't afford to fight the political battles over things like the Federal Writers Project. We were then in a transition period without yet fully recognizing it from the Great Depression to a defense economy. The fire had gone out of the New Deal. The WPA was undergoing liquidation, and the administration was not sticking its neck out on behalf of culture. He had higher priorities. They were called Adolf Hitler. And so what happens is the Federal Theater Project gets eliminated in 1939, in the spring of 1939, in the relief budget that comes out, it is stricken. The Federal Writers Project is diminished. Alsberg is told he has to go. And what happened is, instead of these programs being kind of run from Washington, you needed to get a sponsor to fund 25% of the project. Then the feds will pay the other 75%, but you've got to have a sponsor, a local sponsor to do this, or we're not going to do it. And so Alsberg's goal was basically get sponsors for all of the remaining state guides. And until he did that, he wouldn't quit. And he hung around. He was told basically in April to go, but he didn't go until August, until he got these sponsors lined up. He couldn't focus on sponsors for things like the slave narratives or the Finns of the Keweenaw Peninsula. He had to focus on getting the state guides done. The good news is the state guides to this point had been widely acclaimed, and all of the major, these were all, if you look at the publishers on all of these books, these are all big-time publishers. They loved them, and they said so. And that was part of the reason why Alsberg was able to get these things lined up to be finished. And once he got the sponsors set to go, then he left in August of 1939. The Federal Writers Project continued until let's go here. The last book the Federal Writers Project was produced in 1941. Michigan was produced in 1941. There were about 8 or 10 books that came out in 1941. The last one was Oklahoma in late 1941, and so we have a celebration, the American Guide Week. But here's a couple of things that were written by very prominent critics about the American Guide series. Lewis Mumford is probably the most prominent social critic in the United States between, say, 1925 and 1955. I'm not sure when Mumford died, but he was, a very well-known guy. Of all the good uses of adversity, one of the best has been the conception and execution of the series of American guidebooks, the first attempt on a comprehensive scale to make the country itself worthily known to Americans. Future historians will turn to these guidebooks as one who knows the classic world must still turn to Pausanias' ancient guidebook to Greece. I've read parts of Pausanias' guidebook. Okay? This is about posterity. The future will learn about America from these books. And then Louis Brumfield was a literary critic he's with the New York Herald Tribune, another big guy in the world of critics. I have found the guides which I have thus far seen as fascinating reading as anything I have encountered in many years. I mean to see every one of the 48 on my own library shelves for the benefit of myself, my children, and my grandchildren. This is about posterity, right? That's what makes these things so cool, right? This is the best look you're ever going to get about American society. It's never been matched. Now, the fact that it's 1935, I find that fascinating. But clearly it's 80 years ago. So the question is, what are the guides? There are 52 of these books. They look, except for the Washington, D.C. and the Idaho books, they all look exactly the same. And we're just going to kind of flip through these. One of the things all of them had, at least initially, was a map like this. I have the Michigan map flopped out over there. Don't take out any of the maps that are in here. They're 80 years old. They're brittle as heck. So don't take any of them out. But if you want to see what one looks like, the Michigan map is over there. What would be good now is if you kind of opened your book to the table of contents in whatever book you have, and it will look very similar to this. If you have one of the New England books, that was the model that they wound up using, is what they did in New England. Now, the New England books are a little bit different. Some of them are a little bit different, but basically this is the way it works. You've got this general background. These are a series of essays, about a dozen or 15 essays on different topics: the contemporary scene, the natural setting, archaeology and Indians, history and government, and all that. They're not the same. They vary from state to state, but there's these essays. Alsberg was very much into this. He thought this was where they were going to achieve a lot of literary credibility, is in the essays that were produced here. It appears as though he arranged for something like 5,000 professors and other scholars not to write these things, although here's one. This one was actually written, these two were written by outsiders. These were scholars of one kind or another that wrote these particular chapters. But he had literary figures, or professors and scholars of one kind or another, edit these essays to make sure that they were up to snuff. That's another thing to note here, is that Alsberg was absolutely adamant that this stuff be accurate. I mean, he just wouldn't tolerate anything. Some of those early administrators that I mentioned, some of the stories you hear about them is, just make it up. Nobody cares. That's not the way Alsberg was going to play this. So while I'm not going to say you're not going to find mistakes in these things, they're pretty accurate. Alsberg was absolutely insistent on that. In any event, so you have these essays, then you have cities, and it depends on the state, but usually it's in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 towns, not necessarily the biggest. The people of Jackson, Michigan were absolutely infuriated that Jackson doesn't show up here. There's a section on Jackson, and it's got 6 or 8 pages in the book, but it doesn't have its own chapter. And so Jackson, the people in Jackson said, basically, these books are worthless because we don't have our own chapter. Any event, so you have the state or the city guides, and then you have what I think is the most fascinating part, the tours. We'll talk about those in a moment. And there's pictures, lots of pictures. Okay, sometimes they're in separate sections in the book. Sometimes they're scattered throughout the book. That depends on the state how they did that, and what time they were published. And again, we're going to hold a mirror up to America. These are not Chamber of Commerce pictures. There are some Chamber of Commerce pictures, but this is America as it exists in the 1930s. There's no intent here to gloss this stuff over. Again, then you get to the essays, and I've got to give you one example here. Again, Alsberg and the boys back in Washington, they wanted these things to reflect local differences. They wanted them to be balanced, but they wanted them to reflect the societies that were writing the books, the states. Okay? So this is something that shows up here. The Mexican has been called the chore boy of Arizona. His economic status is such that he has little opportunity to adopt the modes of life followed by the lighter-skinned people who employ him. Now, up to that point, all right, that's probably a fairly accurate statement. But notice what comes next. But it is also true that he has slight inclination to change his ways. That's the stuff that people who will critique these books in 2024 will find offensive. Do I find that offensive? Yeah, but I also think it's accurate. It's the way Americans would view these Mexicans working in Arizona. I think it's perfectly accurate. So, am I offended by it? No. Is it a shame that this is what was written? Yeah. But is it accurate?
I think, excuse me. Years ago, I worked for the Foreign Student Advisor at OCC in Farmington. And she was Lebanese. She would talk on the phone to her daughter. She did not want her daughter and her daughter's children to adapt American ways. So it's not something that's still going on.
Yeah,
I mean, for a while, until people from other countries live here long enough to understand.
Yeah, but this is not about adopting Mexican or American ways. This is about the Mexican having slight inclination to change his ways. That is to become more productive. That's what they're talking about here.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's more discriminatory than that. But in any event, the point is really this, that Washington was editing this stuff, but they weren't trying to sugarcoat it. And the essays are one of the places where this stuff shows up. Then you get to the cities and towns. Invariably, there's always a brief description of the towns that I always think is kind of fun to look at. The number of bus stations. We've got the Union Station, the Southeastern Greyhound, the Dixie Greyhound, the Lewisburg Bus Line, the Consolidated Bus Lines, the Tennessee Transportation Company, the Tennessee Coach Company, and the Ladd Motor Coach Company. And then, on 6th Avenue, we've got the Waller Bus Line. Okay? They'll talk about the radio stations in town, where the hippodrome is, the boxing, the tennis courts, all that kind of stuff. Okay? And this is always interesting when you look in the southern towns. We have accommodations. There's 11 hotels, 4 of them for Negroes. This is as close as you're going to get to a AAA guidebook. You don't find any hotels in this stuff, or restaurants, or any of that kind of reference at all. That's it. Okay, you can find your hotels on your own. There's 11 of them. 4 of them are for blacks. But that's what's there. And then you're going to have a map of the town, and each of these things are, pretty standard. Here's tourist places that you want to go visit in that particular town.
All of this from Google, huh?
Well, predates Google. Oh, yeah. Actually, all of these books are available online. So this was the cleanest copy I could get as I went on Google and found a copy of Nashville, and I just copied that. I mean, I have that in a book form, but it wouldn't look as good as this. And then you get to the tours, which is my favorite part, right? I started collecting these things 50 years ago, maybe more than 50 years ago. It took me until about 10 years ago to get my last book, the Pennsylvania book. Who's asking for Pennsylvania? Somebody was asking for Pennsylvania. Well, that was my last book, was finding the Pennsylvania book. I'd get these in used bookstores all over the country. Whenever I'd travel, my daughter sitting back there, she would have spent lots of time in used bookstores across the country. As my kids are playing soccer all over the United States, you know, in between games, I'm going to the used bookstores. And that's where I got most of these things, quite honestly. Pennsylvania, I kind of gave up and I got it online because I couldn't find it anywhere else. And I've been looking for 50 years, so to hell with it, I'm just going to buy it online. But you can get these things online. In any event, the idea is if you're going to take a tour, you might start with, say, well, we'll start here. US 31 starts in Mackinac. And you start at Mackinac City and you start driving south. And after a certain number of miles, you come to a town or a wide spot in the road or something interesting. And they'll say, at mile 3.7 is this thing. Now, it might be a town, it might be a bridge, it might be a cabin, it might be, you know, who knows what. It might be a big tree. And then you go to mile 5.4 and there's something else. And then you just keep going through the state until you get to Indiana. And then we start the next tour. Again, whenever I go anywhere, I always have these books with me. They're still incredibly useful today. So Peggy and I, my wife and I, were up in Traverse, or Petoskey, I guess, is where we started. And so we're going down 31. And so we're just driving south, and we see something about the Green Sky Mission. And there's a picture in the book of the Green Sky Mission. So we go down, and US 31 is different now than it was before. Now the old 31 is a dirt road. And so we get off on this dirt road, and we go to follow some signs for the Green Sky Mission, and there it is today. We get into Traverse City, and there's the Con Foster Museum. Con Foster was apparently a circus guy who made some money, and he collected Native American artifacts. And in Traverse City, I think he became mayor, and he builds the Con Foster Museum to exhibit all of his circus stuff and his Native American memorabilia. It's now Bijou by the Bay that Michael Moore renovated, and it's a theater up in Traverse City. It's still there. And so we go down farther to Filer Fiber. It was a pulp mill in the 1930s. Well, there it is today, Packaging Corporation of America. Further down here, I didn't get that far, but I ran into some reference to a dairy company. I looked the darn thing up online, and they still produce dairy products, and you can buy their stuff mostly in convenience stores and gas stations. It's still there, okay? And then you run across the really weird stuff. Also on this trip, when you get to Hart, which is 114 miles along this road, right from Hart on County 570, I suppose I should put my glasses on, which is Main Street, is Mears. And you got to go 4 miles on this county road. Population 912, where Swift Lathers publishes Mears News, a weekly printed from a handset type on a letter-size sheet and containing straightforward and outspoken local news and comment. The news, it's NEWZ, by the way, NEWZ, has a wide circulation outside of Mears among readers interested in unusual journalism. Well, I read this and I thought, well, what the hell is this? So I have to go dig it up and try and find out who this Swift Lathers was. Apparently he worked in Detroit, he was a newspaperman, got fed up with Detroit, came back to Mears and started publishing this thing on a hand press. And it became so popular that at one point he decided, I don't want to make this many. So anybody whose letters or whose name began after S, he dropped them from the rolls. That's Swift Lathers. I mean, interesting guy. I was doing this talk somewhere not too long ago, and somebody knew about Swift lathers and mirrors.
I think it was me, and my mom was born in years.
There you go. But this is the kind of stuff you stumble across. I mean, sometimes, I'm always disappointed when I get someplace and I don't find anything, or I go through a town and there's nothing in the book. There isn't everything here. Remember, they went from 5 million words to 175,000 words. They had it probably at some point, but by the time it didn't make it through the cutting room floor. These things are just absolutely fascinating. All over the country, you can get these things for every state. There's a full collection online at Rowan University. It has all of the states, except Michigan, so you can get Michigan here. They're all available on Kindle. They'll cost you, I think, $7. I was in one of these talks. I did one a few months ago, and for some reason, I didn't bring my Massachusetts book. Well, I want to use the Sacco and Vanzetti thing because it's kind of cool. So I just opened it up online and read it from the screen, right? And I didn't have my Kindle with me, but I had my phone, and I tried to download it, and I can't download Kindle on my phone. I can only download it from a Kindle device. So I went online and just found it as, online that way. But, some of these, I now have the Massachusetts one, by the way, on my Kindle. I got that one. And I just went to New York, and so I got the New York on my Kindle. $7. It's cheap. If you buy one of these things, the good books, the only book I don't have is the Puerto Rico book. Going price now is between $300 and $400. It's going to be a while before my daughter saves up enough money to buy me the Puerto Rico book. There were over 1,000 books published from this series. There's lots of these things that are out there that you can get that are, again, they're not all guidebooks. There's other books that are available that were produced by the Federal Writers Project. The life histories, those oral histories, they're available on the Library of Congress. The slave narratives are available on the Library of Congress, although the slave narratives have all been published now. You can get those as hard copy books. And there you go. Are they perfect? No. But they're the best thing you're ever going to find about life in America. So there you go. Next time you take a trip, get your Federal Writers Project book and take it with you. Of course, have a better map, right? Make sure you have access to Google so you can look this stuff up, and get off the beaten path. I mean, this is not get on I-75. Remember, the interstates weren't there at this time, and the routes of the U.S. highways and the state highways that they use have often changed. Remember, when these things were written, the U.S. Highway Department had only started to construct the U.S. highways 12 years earlier. 1923. That's when the U.S. Highway Department, they actually didn't label them. The labeling of the highways didn't come in until either 24, I think it's 25. So, anyway, there you go. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
That was a very nice lecture. My compliments.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
Yes. It was very thoughtfully done. You did a hell of a lot of research.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time reading stuff. Questions? Any questions?
I already forgot his name.
Alsberg, yeah.
What happened to him? They wanted him.
Yeah, it's interesting. He suffered, immediately what happened is when he left there, he wound up getting hired, I'm not sure at what point. He went to work for the federal government during the war, then they fired him because of his connection with Martin Dies. Oh. Martin Dies made sure he got fired. Okay. And he had to go, and I think he got called up in front of the McCarthy committee too. I mean, Alsberg was no radical. I mean, he was his friends would call him a philosophical anarchist, whatever the heck that meant. He was one of the first Americans who, I mean, he was certainly not a conservative guy. He was one of the first Americans, he was over in Russia, okay, when he was, you know, as a newspaper man and when he was distributing refugee money and that sort of thing. He was one of the first Americans to come out and said this Soviet Union stuff is not right. This is, he came out very strongly against that in his circle of friends, and they ostracized him because a lot of his friends were left-leaning, and he was one of the ones that came out and said that the Soviets had it wrong. He was never politically active. Was he a philosophical socialist or a philosophical anarchist? Yeah, okay, I'm not sure what that means, but okay. So he lost jobs and couldn't get jobs with the federal government because of the affiliation that Dyes penned him with in 1938. But he wound up going to work for, I think it was Random House. Initially, what happened is the first thought was, we're going to produce one big book of the United States. Well, they thought about that for about 5 minutes and decided that's a bad idea. And so the second idea, which was Alsberg's, was we'll produce 5 regional books. I mentioned there were 5 regional directors. Well, those were going to be the 5 books. But after a very short time, by August, middle of August, they decided of 1935 that that wasn't going to work and it made more sense to do it state by state. Well, after the war, Random House hired Alsberg to go through and edit this stuff and create those 5 books. And so he did that for, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years. And then retired and moved to California where his sister lived. He spent some time in Mexico. Alsberg was gay. He was gay, Jewish wing. The guy had some strikes, okay? But in his older years, he started to produce stuff that was unapologetically, I guess, gay literature. I mean, it wasn't so much he was writing novels or anything. He was simply writing about his own personal experience as being somebody who was in the closet. He spent a lot of time in Mexico. He died in California, I think, living with his sister. And his papers are in a California institution. I can't remember offhand. There's a pretty good book about Henry Alsberg, but he's one of these guys that somebody needs to produce a movie about Alsberg. He is a really, really interesting guy. Really interesting. Yeah.
Who did you say Reds was about? Reds, the movie?
Reds was about John Reed.
John Reed. And then I wanted, I'm looking at the Colorado book, which didn't get published until 41.
Yeah.
But yet they had 6 printings of it.
Yeah.
So it went on for a while.
Yeah.
Even though the federal government wasn't.
Well, I mean, the feds produced it, and then these publishers would simply reproduce them because the demand was pretty high. And then what happened in the 50s, some states took these and revised them, modernized them. And I have a few of those books still. That's when I go buy books now, I'm weeding out the old ones. If you get a book, get one that is one of the original printings, not one that's it doesn't have to be a first printing or anything, but one that is not, that was done in the 40s, before they started to go in and edit these things. Because if you start to look at, like, I have the Illinois book from, I think it's done in 50 something or other, and I keep forgetting to try and find a replacement for it. But the point is that it's talking about the 1950s in Illinois. Which is, there's nothing wrong with that, but it isn't what I want, okay? So my suggestion is take a look whether these are revised editions. And then some other states got into it in the 1970s. You can find paperback editions of a number of states that are out there. And they're fine, but I'm not sure what editions they are. I would always aim for the earlier ones, because then you're really getting the true story. When you get the revised editions, you don't know really what you're getting. So.
Thank you.
All righty. Thank you very much.